Hello everyone, Salam, Namaste, Adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we have Professor Dhruv Raina, a very well-known professor of history and philosophy of science and education, who is a former professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is going to talk on internationalization of the sciences, India and the circulation of scientific knowledge and practice. He is going to be introduced formally by Dr. Om Prasad, who is assistant professor at Indira Mahendra School of Education at Mahendra University, Hyderabad, I believe. And his interest is on the history of science and education. And the concluding remarks will be given by Professor Benjamin Zakaria, who is a member of the Einstein Forum research staff, and he's a former professor of history at Calcutta and Halle in Germany. And he was connected also with JNU. And he did his PhD from Cambridge, Trinity College. So welcome you all. And now I invite Dr. Om Prasad for the formal introductory remarks.
Thank you, Razi Saab, for the uh, invitation and also for giving me the honor to introduce my own teacher. I mean, now he's a friend, but I think the relationship of teacher is one that supersedes my relationship with Dhruv still. And I have the enviable job of introducing him. So even though there's a script, I'll try and speak from my memory and my association with Dhruv for I think almost 14 years now. Professor Dhruv Raina was formerly a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University at the Zakir Hussain Center for Education, where for many years he taught history of science, philosophy of science, and the history of education and knowledge. Uh, he started out wanting to be a theoretical physicist, studied physics in his undergraduate and also for his master's at IIT Bombay, but the future had better things in store for him, and he turned for the for our advantage and for our benefit. We have benefited from his turn towards the history and the philosophy of science, and he went on to be a fellow at NISTADS first and worked in the national what used to be the National Institute for Science, Technology and Development. It's part of the CSIR. It has now changed its name and changed many things along with it. Um, uh, and Dhruv, of course, for the last 30, 40 years has been one of probably India's most foremost historian of science. And he has worked on a variety of issues, starting with the history of mathematics as part of the Delhi Renaissance, where he collaborated with his long-time collaborator, Professor S. Irfan Habib, on the mathematical writings of Master Ramchandra, the well-known Urdu journalist and mathematician. And over the years, he has worked on the writing of history or the historiography of science, especially on the group of historians of science who took their inspiration from the work of the British biochemist and historian of science from China, Joseph Needham. Over the years, of course, his own research interests have evolved, and you can see that in his publications, um, starting with the history of mathematics, moving on to the history of the French Jesuits in India and their contributions to astronomy and mathematics. From there, moving on towards concerns which had to do with larger concerns in the history and sociology of knowledge, and the institution of the university as a site of production of knowledge. Um, and and you see over the years, as we were having a small conversation around this, he's now turned his focus towards trying to understand both this idea of what decolonization is, what it means to the practice of and understanding of science and the university. Of course, the topic today is something which he has been concerned with since his early writings in the history of science of India. I mean, he might tell you that some of the concerns that that are associated with circulation of knowledge, where where a central part of a group of historians working between India, France, Africa, Latin America, and Australia. And Nistad's, where he was based for a long time, was one of the centers for this group called Science and Empires. And over the years, he has also worked on the internationalization, what it means to have a globalized science research system, and the kind of implications that had for the development of India's research system. And even though he is formally retired as a professor, he continues to teach on and off in different universities, like in Goa, where he was the D.D. Kosambi chair, and also at the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research at Pune. So, without further ado, I think I'll pass it over to Dhruv. Thank you. Thank you for this.
Thank you, Razi Sahab, and the for inviting me to speak to you all today. It is indeed an honor, and thank you, Om, for the generous introduction. Yeah, I'd like to speak about the internationalization of science, and I think Om has already given you a hint of what I shall be saying. Um, in the sense that I would like to make a little distinction between the processes of the internationalization of science and the globalization of the sciences. And I would like to also say that, contrary to the kind of history of science we were brought up on as students of history of science, which was quite Eurocentric in its orientation, I think the work of historians of science over the last 4 decades have played an important role in remedying our Eurocentric picture of the history of sciences. And we see a renaissance of what we might call the global history of sciences. That in itself is a separate story, but that story also tells us that we need to caution ourselves that if we throw Eurocentrism out of the window, we do not replace Eurocentrism with other kinds of civilizational or denominational or ethnocentrisms. One the answer to one centrism is not another centrism. And that poses a range of problems that how does one write a cognitively just history of the sciences and of knowledge. But I'm not going to go into that those set of concerns today, although they are at the edge of what I shall be or what I shall be speaking about. Uh, but it is important to note that, and this is some of the things we have, an important fact we have learned from the history and philosophy of science. I'm not saying history of science alone, but from the history and philosophy of science, is that the way science is practiced, the institutional organization of science has changed over the centuries. All right, it has evolved. It has evolved in a way that, well, its methods have changed, its practices have changed, its research protocols have changed, its procedures have changed. And so when we speak about science in the ancient world, when we speak about science in ancient Greece or India or Persia or China, we speak of science during the medieval period in the Islamicate and other parts of the world. We speak of modern science, and we speak of not modern science in the 17th century, but when we speak of modern science in today's age, we are speaking of something which is changing. I mean, whose methods have evolved, whose practices have changed, and the way this production of knowledge itself is organized has been evolving. It hasn't been constant. I think this is an important factor to take home. But if science itself has been changing, if the institutional organization of science has been changing, forgive me for using two polysyllabic words here, okay, that is institution and epistemologies or ways of knowing, that that institutional forms and ways of knowing change together. They co-evolve. All right. Now, while this has been happening in the world of science, something else has been happening in the history of sciences. The way we have studied and looked at upon and framed the history of sciences in the 18th century underwent dramatic change in the 19th century, underwent dramatic changes again in the first half of the 20th century, and as I just pointed out a few minutes ago, has undergone a great deal of change over the last 3 to 4 decades. So, the history of sciences, too, the methods historians of science adopt, the questions they ask, these two have changed over time. But there is a kind of coupling here, and this coupling is that, in fact, sometimes the questions historians of science ask are also related to the contemporary practice of science. In other words, what historians of science ask is, in a way, as one historian of science put it, is in a way parasitic upon the contemporary practice of science. Right? But this is not the whole story. It is not that, the questions historians of science ask is parasitic upon. I mean, what do I mean with that? A few days ago, I was invited to deliver a talk to a community of really leading researchers from India. And suddenly a question came up that at what point in our history did we stop being sustainable? And I said, this is, I'm sorry to again use a technical term, this is what the historian of ideas, Quentin Skinner, would call an error of prolepsis. All right? That our concerns about sustainability are very contemporary concerns. And then to project the idea of sustainability on to the past would be an error. All right. But I still had to answer the question. And in answering the question, I said that let us assume that we admit the question, that we are using today's notion of sustainability and looking at the past. Then, of course, we could say that we stopped being, if we were sustainable, if we did have a sustainable civilization even before the age of modernity, then it stopped being so with the rise of capitalism. But I am not an ecologist. And so I said, but then why do we stop with the rise of capitalism? I think sustainability more or less came to an end in any way with the emergence of the first city-states in antiquity or even pre-antiquity. So that's another issue. So the point I'm saying is that, yeah, there is a kind of dependence between the questions that historians of science ask and the practice of science. All right. Uh, Now, the thing is that this dependence is never total. All right. I mean, as we well know, I mean, especially today, that uh, historians of science also ask questions which are quite independent of the contemporary practice of science. And this begins to be increasingly so as history of science becomes an independent discipline and not a discipline that is tied to the strings of the sciences themselves. All right. So when history of science becomes an independent discipline with an independent department, not linked up with departments of sciences as it was in the 19th century, then historians of science begin to ask a set of questions which are distinct from and are not entirely dependent upon the practice of science, but are in a way more linked with the questions that historians and social sciences also ask when they begin to look at science as a form of as a form of culture. All right. So and these questions then have to do with the collective intellectual contemplation of academic communities. All right. So what I shall talk today is will tell a kind of interrelated story. By interrelated, I mean that I will simultaneously talk about what is happening in the world of science, but also what is happening when we frame the history of science, when we begin to write the history of science. All right. So I'm looking at the the dialectic between these two, or if you want to put it in another way, the evolving relationship between the present of science and the memory of science. All right. And so, how does the framing of the history of science coupled with the collective social life of the scientific community? So that's the story I would like to tell. And when I tell this story, well, I don't know how many historians there are in the audience, but I do know one who's called Benjamin Zachariah, who will probably respond to me. Uh, there was an attempt at some point in the 19th century to write a history without names. All right, that is without naming people. And in some sense, I shall partially proceed with that kind of a history. I would name some people, but I don't intend to tell the story about individuals, but I wish to talk about certain historical processes. All right, of how certain historical structures emerged and uh, how they evolved, uh, how they evolved over time. And the processes I would be looking at are the processes of internationalization and how this process of internationalization has a kind of internal logic having to do with the practices of an emerging community of scientists who are acutely now self aware of their separate identity as scientists. We should remember that the word scientist itself was coined only in the 1850s. All right. But this is also linked to certain geopolitical changes which we begin to see from the end of the 19th century and which then emerge full blown in the 1950s during the processes of decolonization as a number of colonies divest themselves of the yoke of a colonial rule. All right. And these changes we are talking about, these changes which take place over a century, these processes which begin at the end of the 19th century, and then there are a number of other developments which we see through the 20th century. We know that, the 20th century actually begins with a bang. It begins with a bang where in the first 3 decades, we see three scientific revolutions. All right. But there are also a number of social transformations and political transformations that are taking place. And so it's important to situate then how these developments alter the way we look at the sciences, how they alter the genealogies uh, we produce about the evolution of scientific ideas and how the imaginaries of science change over the time. How our imaginaries of the past of science have changed and how our imaginaries of the present of science also change. All right, now when we speak of internationalization of the sciences, we are speaking of a process that commences towards the end, towards the last decades of the 19th century, and that proceeds at an accelerated rate in the consecutive decades. All right. So, but what happens is that whatever this process, I think before I say anything on the process, just let me give you a little idea as to what I mean by this process of internationalization. All right. Uh, and over here, I turn to the work of the scholar Eugene Rabinovich, who says that, well, internationalization was a recognition of a set of ecumenical traditions and ideals that are common to the scientific profession. All right, what are these ideals and values that begin to be recognized as common to the scientific profession? The first was that scientific knowledge was universally valuable, all right, in its scope and in its contributions. The second, that the methods and practice of science must remain unaffected by culture or politics. Right? And if that was so, that would ensure the unrestricted progress of science and human civilization. The third is that science itself is a kind of lingua franca, a language that promotes a cosmopolitan perspective. It is defined by shared goals and an order that is based on merit that crossed international boundaries. All right. I think this would be a kind of minimalist definition uh, we could work with. Now, scientific internationalism then would hold that the profound benefits, it upholds the profound benefits that the scientific profession could bring to the human mind. These included reason, restraint, and moderation, idealism, tolerance, compassion, devotion, and discipline, and more importantly, a perspective, a critical perspective of what counts as knowledge. All right. And so, what is so special about the end of the 19th century? And over here, we have to turn back to the writings of Louis Pasteur, whom I don't have to explain to the audience who Louis Pasteur was. And it was Pasteur who pointed out that, while contributions to science uh, do in a way enhance the prestige of a nation, science itself is international in its scope and cannot develop without the communication of scientists across national boundaries. All right. So, getting back then to the process, while the process we are talking about does indeed um, become visible, all right, in the sense that scientists begin to communicate with each other across national boundaries. I mean, they had already been doing that from the 17th century. But uh, what happens is that now this activity becomes associated with forms of collaboration across national boundaries and the exchange of ideas across these boundaries. All right. And this process is now institutionally anchored in research institutes, in universities, and departments themselves located within universities. So what happens is the process is now established by scientists across national boundaries and linking universities and research institutes across the globe. At the end of the 19th century, well, the term international must be used in a more European context, but by the first decades of the 20th century, this internationalism begins to change, and as more and more countries from the non-Western world join this international network. of scholars. I'm afraid I don't have, I have two very nice pictures to show, but I've not prepared a slide, but a slide presentation. It's very nice to have a look at the first picture of the Solvay Congress. And over there, you see a gathering, an entirely white gathering of the leading scientists of the world. There's only one woman amongst them, and that is Marie Curie. All right. And then it's nice to have a look at another meeting which takes place in 1930. And suddenly, in the picture, the chromaticity from white begins, largely white, begins to change to people of color and different ethnicities who are now part of the leading community of scientists. I mean, we can see two or three from India, we can see some from Japan and other parts of the world. However, this circulation of knowledge, of artifacts, of goods, and the movement of peoples predates the process, predates this process of internationalization I'm talking about. In other words, I am alluding to the circulation of people, ideas, commodities, goods, etc. And I say this process dates back a very long time. All right. You must have heard recently, I think 2 years ago, of the discovery of the head of a Buddha in Bernica and other items traveling from South Asia in Egypt. All right, close to Alexandria. So this recent archaeological survey, all right, of the statuette of the Buddha and the repeated archaeological discoveries of huge amphoras, probably containing wine, and a large collection of gold coins all along the Coromandel coast tell us about the intense connections between the Roman world and India in antiquity and South Asia in antiquity. All right. And over here, I would like to assess, assert the importance of looking at these exchanges as bidirectional and multidirectional across several cultures and continents, the Gulf of Hormuz, Persia, the Red Sea, etc. So the world was fairly well connected even in the pre-Christian era. All right. Now, I mean, it's difficult to talk about that as internationalism before the nation and the internation, right? But this exchange of knowledge in antiquity, in the medieval world, when the world was again very intensely connected, uh, this exchange of knowledge and material artifacts and practices followed quite variegated practices, naturally changing over the passage of time. So the modes of the exchange of knowledge, the modes of circulation, and the vectors of this circulation have changed over time. All right. With the emergence of the so-called modern sciences in the 19th century, and mind you, I am following the convention of the historian of science Om mentioned, that is Joseph Needham. I don't talk about Western science. I talk about modern science because, as Joseph Needham said, modern science certainly arose in the West, but modern science itself was a product of the conjuncture of knowledges arriving from several other civilizations and cultures in Europe at a particular juncture. All right, so that with the emergence of modern science was certainly a break with the past. All right, a new set of practices, a new set of practices and institutions began to be put in place. All right, uh, in universities from the 17th century onwards, and this These practices were enabled by the founding of a new set of institutions that we refer to as the academies or learned societies, like the Royal Society of London, the Académie des Sciences in France. All right. And these people put into place certain journals, they put into place certain scientific practices, they put into place literary technologies as to how papers were to be written, structured, and presented. They put into place certain protocols of observations. Now, these practices and influences travel through a Europe, not only through the print media, that is, not only through books, journals, monographs, itinerant lecturers who went about delivering lectures on the new sciences, either in England or in other parts of Europe, but through the mobility of, in the 17th and 18th century, they were not called scientists, they were still called savants, across city states and gradually across nations. All right. I mean, uh, we know, for example, that Descartes traveled from from France and settled down for a long time in Sweden. I mean, kings and rulers uh, would think it a matter of prestige to invite a leading scientist in the 17th and 18th century uh, to their kingdoms. So, what became evident was that knowledge and experimental practices and findings were shared despite sometimes the enmity between nations. All right, we know about the Anglo-French Wars at the end of the 18th century, but none of this actually stopped scientific communication. All right, a film I often recommend to my students of the history of sciences is a film from the dating a film made about an episode of the early decades of the 20th century called Einstein and Eddington, right? And this is the time of the First World War, and Eddington takes it upon himself to test Einstein's theory of general relativity, right? So, despite what goes on between nations, I mean, scientists continued to communicate. All right. And this was something that this movement we refer to as scientific internationalism recognized very soon. The idea that science benefited in more ways than one from international collaboration. All right. And though it was recognized by the end and the beginning of the 19th century that prestige from the contribution to the sciences did accrue uh, to the nation. There's a quotation, I mean, imputed to Einstein, where he once said that uh, if his theory of relativity was proved right, uh, then he would be considered a German, but if he was proved wrong, he would be considered a Jew. All right. So, or something to that effect. I don't have the exact quotation in mind. All right. Now, the process of internationalization, all right, accelerated the pace at which scientific knowledge traveled and ensured that the shared protocols, investigative procedures, and calibration of scientific instruments, etc., and scientific values were globalized. All right. Now, I've been talking of internationalism of science, but now I'm talking about a process of globalization. And I think we need to separate out these two terms, as was hinted by Om in his introductory remarks. Now, as historians, we need to then differentiate between different moments of the so-called, what we now call the globalization of knowledge, right? And the internationalization of science. Uh, in a remarkable book uh, on 12 timekeeping devices written by a historian of astronomy called David Rumi. This is a book on 12 leading timekeeping devices across the globe. David Rumi has a chapter on the Jantar Mantar. Very, very good chapter on the Jantar Mantar, right? Which he calls the world's largest sundial. Now, the point Rumi makes is that astronomy was always an international science, by which he refers to the circulation of tables, ephemerides, devices, computational protocols across the globe. All right, clearly, this is not a debatable point. All right, we do know well, not just astronomy, but look at the field of cosmology today, the LIGO experiment, etc. These are truly activities that involve huge teams and huge amounts of funding for international collaboration. All right. And so I do not think that we could contest the point that at one level, in one sense, in a very specific sense, that as far as astronomical knowledge is concerned and the way astronomical knowledge is circulated, uh, it is in a sense international, has always been international in scope. But the second interesting point that he makes is that the astronomer King Jaising was fully aware of the merits of international science. Perhaps, again, we commit an error of prolepsis here by alluding to the projects, uh, the 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 projects pursued at Jai Singh's observatory, the Jantar Mantar. All right. Now, what is certain was that he recognized the importance uh, of other astronomical traditions for what he was doing. He himself, on the one hand, while trained in Jyotisha, was basically refining the tables of Ulugh Beg. All right. And so he was clearly aware of the benefits of mutual learning from several astronomical traditions. In fact, the preface to the Z.J. Muhammad Shahi, a work, well, authored by, but I suppose there were other people who also wrote it, his astronomers also contributed, by Jai Singh. In the preface to the Z.J. Muhammad Shahi, Muhammad Shah writes that, well, Jai Singh has proceeded on a project where he has drawn upon the Sanskritic tradition, the knowledge of the Nujumi, as well as uh, the knowledge of the Danayane Firang. All right. And so, in other words, I have written uh, several papers on his observatory, which I call a cosmopolitan observatory. Right? Cosmopolitanism because he had as his observatory a number of Jyotisha, a number of Nujumi, and he entered into conversations with Jesuit astronomers and he actually informed his son to pay a pension to a Jesuit astronomer from Bavaria who was working at his observatory. All right. And his library itself is testimony to that kind of cosmopolitan knowledge. But nevertheless, as Rooney points out, for astronomy, and a larger point that the historian of science, Raina Daston, makes on what she calls the sciences of the archives, right? There were formal networks of knowledge communities uh, that were exchanging knowledge over the centuries. All right, but the this nature of exchange was very different from what we seem to be talking about when we discuss the internationalization of science at the end of the 19th and through the first half of the 20th century. But what is new towards Razi Saab, how am I doing for time?
It is so illuminating. You can keep on doing. I mean, another 15 minutes.
All right. Okay. So, but what is new towards the end of the 19th century is that the disciplines that we recognize in university departments today, the world over, begin to crystallize in universities of teaching and research. This is a process that commences in the 19th century. And these disciplines are then ensconced within departments and faculties of the universities. Okay. Now, once these departments and faculties are in place, the exchange of knowledge is now regulated by norms, by values, and by robust practices, methods, and more importantly, by research questions. So when this exchange is going on, the research question is the regulator around which this exchange takes place. And the exchange now takes place between these departments and practitioners of science. All right. And this we would refer to as the process of institutionalization. The exchange is now specific to each discipline and each subdiscipline. All right. Now, these exchanges then travel always already along highways established by the learned academies and learned societies and research groups who are anchored not just in research institutes but the universities of teaching and research. The University of Teaching and Research is a novel innovation of the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. All right. It's driven by the Humboldtian idea that good teaching must lead to good research and good research must lead to good teaching, what's called the unity of teaching and research. All right. And it is there that then certain ways of mentoring students to become researchers, ways of presenting research results, etc., begin to be concretized and perhaps to an extent also homogenized, although there are many research traditions. But the interesting feature is that these institutional innovations enhanced the formation of disciplinary research networks of people working in thermodynamics, or people working in electromagnetism, or people working in evolutionary biology, and we can go on and on, people working in organic chemistry, etc. So I would refer to these as disciplinary research communities, right? Transcending now national boundaries, right? And establishing collaborative ties, and uh, across large regions separated by large distances, and sharing research findings. This was indeed the next phase in the evolution of that Enlightenment idea from the 17th century, which we refer to as the Republic of Learning. All right. The and the idea of the university being an open community of scholars. All right. This is an idea which I think is being challenged today. We all who have been in the university more or less globally uh, begin to feel the pinch of the closing of the doors. All right. I do not wish to discuss here the important question of the colonial sciences, of how science was pursued in the 19th century under colonial rule. Much has been written about it. Gyan Prakash wrote a book called Another Reason. Kapil Raj wrote a book called Relocating Modern Science. My colleague Irfan and I wrote a book called Domesticating Modern Science. I mean, there's a great deal which has been written about it, and there's a huge, vast amount of literature, so much so that I mean the work we did in the 1980s has been surpassed by the work of much younger scholars, and this is not something one regrets, but that is the way knowledge advances. But this is not something I'm going to get into now, things which I worked on a long time back. But the point I would like to raise is that it is out of the struggle to divest themselves of the yoke of colonial sciences and the limitations that the first generation universities that were established by the British, that is Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And these universities were set up as examining bodies and not universities of teaching and research. And there is a process of 30 years of struggle which goes on in, in India, where uh, finally in 1904, uh, postgraduate teaching and research is permitted within the university. Now, the historian of science of a generation preceding us, from whom we learned a great deal, the historian of science S.N. Sen, had posed a very important question. And the question he posed was, why is it that the expansion of the modern sciences, why was its expansion so slow in 19th century India when it was the century of the most rapid institutionalization expansion of sciences in Europe? Why was it in India that this process was so lethargic, whereas it was so rapid in the West and other parts of the world? And naturally, historians of the colonial sciences working on the politics of scientific knowledge, uh, economic historians as well, placed the blame squarely on the colonial doorstep. All right. And they are perhaps not wrong in doing so, but we need a little more nuance here. And what we see is that once the University of Teaching and Research is established in 1904, and even the older universities which were examining bodies like Calcutta and Madras and Bombay, begin to have departments of teaching and research. And then we see the establishment of the second generation university, Aligarh Muslim University, Banaras Hindu University, Mysore, Osmania, and we can go on and on and on. I refer to these as the second generation universities. So once these are established, the scientific disciplines begin to be institutionalized. Societies, specialist societies, learned societies dedicated to specific disciplines, physics or chemistry or mathematics, specific journals, the Indian Journal of Physics, the bulletin of mathematics becomes the journal of mathematics. So specific forms of institutionalization produce specific kinds of practices, journals, and modes for sharing research interests. Professorships begin to be set up for each of the disciplines, right? And research positions created. Right? In this process, the Indian community is very quickly drawn into a network of what one might call globalized science. Right? So, having done so, uh, what we can see is that the Ramans, the Boses, the Sahas, as well as so many others, are co-participants now in the creation of modern 20th century physics, and we can tell similar stories for the other disciplines. Now, the networks of collaboration and communication guaranteed that this international ethos of science uh, survived and matured during the most difficult interwar years. So we have this story where you know immediately after the end of the First World War there was an embargo on there was a kind of boycott of German scientists. It lasted a few years, but there was veritably a boycott of German scientists and German science was seen as responsible for triggering off the First World War. And around this time in the early 1920s, uh, J.C. Bose is visiting Europe, and the great Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius writes to him and says, "You're coming to Europe, but please, break the boycott. Go and meet some of the German scientists who would be really interested in your work, and it would be beneficial to you as well." All right. So, uh, so while on the one hand, a leading scientist like J.D. Burnham would go to point out to the West in his important book called The Social Function of Science that while the West had much to offer from the deliberations, uh, the West had much to learn from the deliberations of Indian scientists of how science and technology could be enlisted in the task of nation building, right? I mean, he actually talks about this. And so this is also part of this international ethos of science. On the other hand, during the critical 1930s, scientists forged popular front organizations against fascism and struggled to find places for their scientific colleagues fleeing from Nazi Germany. All right? It is during this period that, well, everybody talks about, we've been long discussions going on the Oppenheimer film, and Oppenheimer's supervisor was Max Born. And Max Born comes and spends some time on Raman's invitation at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, in the 1930s, right? The aeronautical engineering scientist Oscar Klein, I think probably immediately after the war, played an important role in establishing the Department of Aeronautical. Oscar Klein was in Göttingen, in establishing the Department of Aeronautical Engineering at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. And I think he was also the teacher of a very important Indian scientist who subsequently did his PhD at Stanford, Professor Rodam Narasimha. All right. So, however, before the end of the Second World War, the mode of international collaboration uh, was one was one referred to as autotelic. This means that the driving force for collaboration were the disciplinary academic communities themselves, namely the scientists working through associations, learned societies under the rubric of university departments. They were the driving forces of collaboration. After the end of the Second World War, several things changed. Three global trends are particularly important here. The beginnings of the process of political decolonization. The second, the massification of the university. And the third is the beginnings of the Cold War. The beginnings of the Cold War underscored for national governments the strategic importance of pushing the frontiers of scientific and technological knowledge. Now, a new player had entered the world of knowledge production. All right. And this was the Specialist Research Institute. All right. So the university now was not the primary site of knowledge production, but the university was, there was, in competing with the university for very specialist kind of research institutes, which emerged. And actually, we begin to see their emergence in India as well. The first of these we see were in the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, the Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics, and over 20 industrial research labs established under the rubric of the CSIR, the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research. Right. Uh, Now, during the Cold War, I mean, two things happened. All right. I mean, one is, of course, India maintains in the 1950s a position of non-alignment. And because it maintained a position of non-alignment, India was able to draw upon expertise in developing its own human resource and scientific and technological capabilities. It was able to negotiate both sides of the Iron Curtain, all right, through its own collaborations. And where there were certain international restrictions, it managed to develop its own capabilities uh, as well. But I think that, when we talk about these own capabilities, we must recognize that we are now operating in a world of globalized science, all right? So there's no purely indigenous. So, historians now uh, the refer to the 1950s as the long 1950s. It was a period of many, many, many experiments, and and it was the decade of political decolonization, and policy was driven by the premise that economic self-reliance, so essential to maintaining national sovereignty, or else one could lapse into some kind of neo-colonialism. Uh, all right, so economic self-reliance was the antidote to neo-colonialism, could only be founded on scientific and technological self-reliance. That was the understanding of the 1950s. And therefore, the state's commitment to higher education and the massification of the university played a very important role in furthering this process of building scientific capabilities. And although we do not see the benefits immediately, I mean, I have argued in one of my writings that the response one sees, the benefits we see are delayed. You really begin to see all the benefits pouring in out in the late 1970s and the 1980s. All right. The leading Indian scientists who were drawn into the into the networks of international scientists that I speak of the 1920s and the 30s, and who shaped the international ethos of science, continue to be influential in shaping the post colonial scientific and technological organizational framework of science. And this is particularly evident to us in the role played after the end of colonialism, or the role played by people like Blackett and Bernal and a number of others in the institutional and organizational establishment of science in the immediate post-colonial period, something well recorded in the writings and the ethnographic work done by Bob Anderson in a wonderful book called, I think, Nucleus and Nation. Right? I mean, which is a development of his earlier PhD work. And so these scientists were able to draw upon their collegial ties with disciplinary academic communities in the developed world. I think I should finish in about 2 to 3 minutes. Now, the Los Alamos project inaugurated, or the Manhattan Project, had inaugurated a new phase in the practice of science, right? What is referred to as big science. And over the years, the successful pursuit of big science required the reconfiguration of the contract between the state, the university, and institutions of knowledge production. This altered the mode of international collaboration, which formerly was autotelic, and by autotelic I mean driven by the disciplinary academic communities themselves. This form of international collaboration changed to heterotelic collaboration. Namely, international collaboration was now mediated by and between governments through bilateral relations, as well as by intergovernmental agencies such as UNESCO, the first of the post-League of Nations organization. Now, the networks of scientists I speak about, some of whom came together to bring the S into UNESCO. All right. And UNESCO adopted what is called the peripheral principle as a policy instrument in order to level the playing field of science between the developing and the developed world. The peripheral principle basically stated that UNESCO would make scientific interventions in what was called the dark zone, namely the developing world, and not the bright zone. All right? Because, of course, the larger belief was that wars themselves were products of inequality, and it was necessary to balance the inequalities between different parts of the world. But developments in the subsequent decades require a more comprehensive reading of UNESCO's role. In another context, uh, it has been pointed out that the scientific humanism that was the credo of UNESCO in the 1950s grew out of deep reflections of communities of scientists, social scientists, and humanists. Right? So we can see the important role played, by UNESCO in the 1950s, and the role of this internationalist network of science, as well as of scientists and social scientists such as Lefebvre and so many others, and Julian Huxley and Needham and others, all right, who intellectually identified with and participated in the scientific international. Now, what happens after the 1950s, that I think is a story, Razi Saab, for another occasion. I've gone on long enough, and I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Yes, that should be a session number two, but this was very illuminating after a long series of sessions on politics, literature, and all those. This is one session that we really, truly learn many new things. Very illuminating. And now let's hear Professor Benjamin Zakaria, and then after that, we go into question answer session. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dhruv, for the long durée view of scientific development, and thank you for clarifying a picture which has been increasingly muddied in both the telling of the story and the theorizing, and shall we say, the over theorizing that has gone on around it over the last 3 decades. I am particularly drawn to the idea that there are phases that you need to distinguish between internationalism and globalization, and that the position of a national state or the national of a country in these global processes uh, needs to be illuminated not by pointing to what we are likely to do now, their national origins, and therefore uh, the difference between them and so-called normative side of Europe, but in fact the question of participating in the wider processes that we describe as scientists and therefore as participants in the universal, not as people hiding in the particulars. So I don't really disagree with anything, so I don't have any pushback. I have a few points where I would like to invite Dhruv and us to consider a few points a little more closely. And these relates to a very important distinction that Dhruv made in the beginning, where he, I think, distinguished internationalization from anti-Eurocentrization, if we can use that slightly awkward term. The important question of internationalization is that uh, it is larger than simply a question of what is Eurocentric. But so maybe we want to take apart the concept of internationalisms and pluralize it a bit, because we seem to be dealing with a number of things, and I'll mention 3 of these briefly. One form of internationalisms is we did something that contributes to a larger whole. The other, as I've already mentioned, is we are part of the universal. And towards that, there's the question of we are not claiming exceptionalism or prior authorship. We are trying to contribute to a common cause. Now, these might be reasonably obvious, and they were very present in Dhruv's paper, but I think I want to draw attention to these because they're sometimes mentioned together and not separated. And in fact, it would be difficult for a person speaking of internationalisms in science or internationalism in science at any point of the timeline that Dhruv drew for us without understanding that these tendencies can coexist. Uh, the, the yearning for co-authorship, for universalism, and for the emergence from the exceptionalism that was often reserved for the colonial subject. Now, obviously, even within the so-called core, there are people closer to the core and people closer to the periphery or the semi-periphery. Another point that I want to make is that, of course, at one level, understanding the internationalization of knowledge is about science and scientists or about academics and academic practices. But more broadly speaking, the idea of a society governed by science or influenced by the scientific temper, if you like, was about the primacy of reason. It was about an attempt to explain that the scientific temper isn't about everybody's equal training in the practices of producing scientific knowledge, but that the deviation from the attempt to understand the world through reason is likely to get the world into a lot of trouble. So there are, of course, different moments of the globalization of knowledge and the internationalization of the sciences. And since Dhruv pointed out the big transition to the period after the Second World War, I wanted to draw attention to something that used to be called, and probably still is called for those who remember it, the Haldane Principle. And the Haldane Principle, named after J.B.S. Haldane, was based on his advice to the Labour government of post-war Britain, noting that science had now progressed beyond the stage where it could be done ad hoc by private funding or by small pots of money. He recognized that the science that was funded by the state had nonetheless to be independent of the state. And the Haldane Principle, in many ways, remains the unspoken principle that we all gravitate towards when we understand the university as an open community of scholars and the state as the distant, necessary, but not dominant funding agency. So if I remember we got to the stage of, under the Cameron government in Britain, where Cameron said something that some people said was breaking the Haldane Principle. He said, we do not wish to fund any research that isn't beneficial to the state. But the universality of the university as an open community of scholars is something that requires robust internal procedures, robust forms of self-regulation, and a very strong academic collective conscience. I simply want to raise the question here, because we can't answer that easily, is what on earth have we done to this collective conscience? What do we as academics have to contribute to the destruction of that community? But perhaps this links a little bit to Max Born not staying in banking. And I wonder maybe if Dhruv wanted to tell us that story a little bit more. And I think the last highlight that I wanted to make from Dhruv's talk is the importance of understanding science as a united endeavor. And in a world where we talk increasingly of alternative sciences or other knowledge systems or indigenous knowledge or whatever you want to call it, we might wish to remember that there were earlier generations of people who didn't wish to call indigenous knowledge systems somehow exceptional and better, but they were interested in the worlds that could contribute to the common scientific endeavor. I can think of Prafulla Chandra Rai, somebody Dhruv has done a lot of work on, and I have done a little work on. And Prafulla Chandra Rai was very concerned with finding translatable scientific terms, but he also was very clear that Indian knowledge systems contained a lot that could be assimilable to modern scientific practice and a lot that could not, just as Europe had a similar problem. The chemistry, for instance, had a connection with medicine and science on the one hand, and with alchemy and magic on the other. He didn't want to. And I think that kind of imagination remains something that we need to keep in mind, because even as we could be said to have been too quick to dismiss indigenous knowledge systems in a world of, if you like, Eurocentric arrogance, this world has long ceased to exist. It has, in fact, gone far too much the other way, whether we're willing to see it or not. And guilty white scientists, or more often guilty white social scientists, and angry post-colonial and decolonial scholars have one thing in common. They think that science is a suspicious practice. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So before entering into question and answer session, just an announcement for the coming Saturday. Dhruv Saab, from physics and material to metaphysics, we are entering into a session coming Saturday on Ramadan. Um, it is not on religious side, perhaps, because Danish Iqbal usually talks about literature. So over to Dr. Rafat Hussain for question and answer session. Take it out. Okay. Thank you. Rafat?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin. And thank you, three learned professor, Professor Raina, Professor Prasad, and Professor Zakaria. So the question and answer session is open now. You can raise your hand, the digital hand, in the digital hand in the box, or write a comment in the chat box, and I will go through them. So let's see if there is, okay. So the first one is from Dr. Nazir Ahmed. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Saab. Very thought-provoking, illuminating lecture. My question relates more to the epistemology of knowledge rather than historiography. The answer is in the question, and the question tends to be rather broad. So allow me to offer a couple of examples to illustrate what I'm going to ask. When we think of the invention of the concept of zero, we find that it was invented independently in India and by the Mayans. Many years ago, when I was traveling through Anatolia, I was struck by a triangular arch that the Turks invented in the 12th century. And in Latin America, the Aztecs also came up with the triangular arch at the same time. And thirdly, many, many years ago, when I was talking to a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, the subject of the evolution and the construction of radio came up, and he said to me, "What do you mean that Marconi invented radio? It was Professor Popov." So we see that knowledge emerges as an ablative stream out of the human breast from many, many cultures. So when we impose a structure on it, it is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gives a certain purpose and direction to it, but at the same time, it becomes a constraint. Now, as you rightly pointed out, sir, the universities in the United States and Europe did bring together, facilitate the coalition coming together of people of knowledge. But the important thing was it was the people of knowledge. Now, I went to Caltech as a Tata scholar way back in 1960 because I was attracted to von Karman rather than the institution itself. So my question is this: is it correct to maintain that science is a convective process, or is it an illuminating process? Namely, should we not be focusing on enabling individuals to give expression to the universal originality bestowed by the creator, the inventive urges that they have, rather than imposing the structures as we do very well in India? So many institutions, structures, culture, nothing happens. Your comment, sir.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so your two questions, big ones. Um, yeah. So is it a convective process or is it an illuminating process? I think the question is actually about two different moments. The process of generation is a convective one. The output is what is illuminating. All right. The the underlying it is what one might call an ocular centric vision of what knowledge is, and which all civilizations more or less share, that knowledge is that which illuminates, which dispels darkness. That is what is knowledge. All right. And ignorance is darkness. So yeah, so regarding your question about the convective and illuminating process, that would be my response. Your second question, I mean, your first comments, which I did, I mean, also your comments sort of triggered off something with me, and I totally agree with you that in the world of knowledge, there are many independent discoveries. I mean, in India, for example, today, uh, there's a priority dispute which I don't consider, to be very serious. That we had the Pythagorean theorem, and we know from the work of Walter van der Waal and others that the property of Pythagorean triples was known all the way from Eastern China to Stonehenge. All right, but what we call the Pythagoras' theorem is something which is formulated in another way based on another set of principles, and therefore we need to recognize different mathematical styles, right? And very often there are independent discoveries which follow very different routes. I mean, we know that, well, we call something Riemannian geometry, but Bollier and Lobachevsky themselves were also had independently arrived at something like that. So that's one part of the story which I concur with. Now, the other part of the story is that how scientific knowledge is produced. And I think that the production of scientific knowledge, we were prone to a certain ideological notion of how knowledge is produced, that it is born in the minds of deeply gifted individuals, probably graced by superior intelligence, however we interpret the term graced with superior individual. But I think the work of scholars over the last 100 years seems to show that actually knowledge is collective, is collectively produced. All right. And that each of us brings to it our own shade, our own collection, but a certain kind of complexion, to this process of the production of knowledge. But it is something that is collectively produced. Now, this idea was deeply debated in 17th century and 18th century Europe. That is knowledge really something which is produced in the minds of gifted individuals? Can individuals surpass the creation of the creator? And when you began to ask questions about how knowledge is produced, when we come into the world of modern science, we come to the recognition that a method has been invented which enables us to make discoveries. All right. And therefore, if we can in some way pass on this message to generations of students, then they do not necessarily have to be gifted to make discoveries. All right. So now we have two sides. I mean, two sides to what we are talking about. That one, does individual contribution matter? Yes, individual contributions matter, but the individual cannot make a contribution unless there is the collective availability of knowledge within a community. Right? So, well, you can create institutions, but can you create an appropriate context for the generation of knowledge? That, of course, is a larger question. So, I mean, I would pray to differ with you on the question of the place of the individual as the site of the creation of new knowledge in order to opt for a more communitarian view of the production of knowledge. But we can create facilities within communities which are indeed uh, which would indeed promote a culture for the production of knowledge, and we can indeed create conditions for communities that impede the creation of knowledge. So, yeah, I don't know whether that answers your question, but yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Raina. So, I do not see any hand raised. Okay, let's see chat box.
There's something in the chat box in
Yeah,
my observation.
I see that. Okay, Mr. Javed, please go ahead and say, come on.
Thank you, Professor Raina, for a wonderful talk on history of science. Of late, I have also been interested in the history of science, and in my observation, I have found that the extent of scholarship on the history of science in India, which is already very scant, and the day-to-day, everyday pedagogical discourses related to science in Indian universities, colleges, and schools have been by and large divorced from each other. We have not learned much from the scholarship on history of science, and we have not been able to bring this into the everyday pedagogical discourses. And I think that as a result, there have been a recent spurt in the priority claims under the name of IKS, the Indian Knowledge System. So don't you think, because you said that you recently in your comment, while you were commenting to the previous question, you said you don't think it is very serious. So don't you think it is high time that the scholars of history of science should intervene and show us some possibilities of bringing all these scholarship on history of science into the pedagogical discourses on science education? Thank you.
Javed Saab, I totally agree with you. In fact, I mean, over the last 3 to 4 years, I have been writing papers where I've been pointing out that where the importance of the need for serious scholarship on the history and philosophy of science uh, uh, should influence science education and how it should do so. Uh, but this was something which was said 50 years ago, and somehow it was something which was restricted merely to school education. And the additional argument I'm proposing is why the scholarship on the history and philosophy of science is also relevant to uh, uh, a collegiate education. Now, I think that the scholarship on the history of sciences, if not the philosophy of science, on the history of sciences in India is at least now, more than 100 and 120 years old. I mean, Ben Zachariah was talking about the great work. It's still a landmark work of Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray on the history of chemistry. So there is a great deal of scholarship, all right? And there is scholarship on both sides. And my colleague Irfan and I have we spent a long time basically disputing the place of priority disputes in the history of sciences, right? And in that, as Om rightly pointed out, we were inspired by the work of Joseph Needham, and the founder of the research institute we worked in, which Om mentioned, NISTADS, Professor Abdul Rahman, was a great fan of Joseph Needham, and he basically introduced us to Needham's ideas and his vision. Irfan and I edited a book also, and so in that vision, there was no place for any centrisms or exceptionalism. All right, science was ecumenical. However, for lots of people in India, in the the history of science is about settling priority disputes. Now, if you had asked me in the 1950s, is it an important concern? And I would have said, yeah, in a just decolonizing nation, let's get the story right. But I don't think 50 years or 70 years later, these should be the concerns. I mean, as I said today, I am more concerned with the process, and historians of science should do that. Yes, you are right in saying that as historians, as academic historians and philosophers of science, we have at least failed in our task. We have failed in our task in saying that, you know what, we are not buying into any centrisms. All right, whether it is a Eurocentrism or Hindu centrism or Sinocentrism or Islamic centrism, we are not buying into any of this. Right? Maybe we were not forceful enough because we thought, well, Eurocentrism was a dying horse. Okay. And now, well, the beast faces us in the eye. And how do we uh, combat this beast? That requires at least some serious thinking. But I think one way, and that is the way I have chosen, is through one's own work and writing and lecturing, one reveals and discusses three important guiding principles of the world of knowledge. The connectedness of the world of knowledge, one. The idea of theoretical pluralism, all right? And the third is the idea of the diversity of knowledge forms. All right. Now, I think what passes for Indian knowledge system is rather monolithic. It is not comprehensive enough. It is not comprehensive enough to embrace what Indian knowledge systems are, and in which the lesser traditions are marginalized at the expense of the high traditions. And that is not cognitive justice. Yeah. So, yeah.
That's good. Thank you, Professor. Okay, the next is Dr. Ayaz Ahmad, please.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your exceptional discussion of the history of sciences. You pointed out in response to another question, and generally also, that between individual and community, you have sort of preference that it is the community which makes available certain culture and certain forms of imaginaries through which individual then becomes more fertile and creative in producing science. So my question is that what do you more specifically see through the history of science, how communities and cultures over a period of time become more open, more receptive to make those nodal points available to individual, and what tendencies do you see in communities and culture which then close off some of those possibilities in which individuals thrive. So lessons in the form of tendencies specifically to communities and cultures where more robust, receptive, culture of this producing knowledge, understanding, and receiving knowledge. Uh, do you keep it only to the sciences, or do you see in larger social political culture? Because my context is also here at Columbia University. We see that something changes in the larger culture, and at the campus, I mean, it becomes at times really impossible to freely and creatively discuss ideas, whether it is ideas of science or philosophy. So what do you offer, or what is your very specific reflection about communities and cultures? How do we lose that capacity to keep individuals in that zone where they can creatively think and produce science or knowledge generally? Thank you.
Yeah, you see, I mean, some of what you're saying is a reflection of the issues Ben raised in his comments to my talk. Now, yeah, I mean, see, when we look at, say, the world of science, I mean, what we if we look at science as social activity, as collective activity, held together, unified by certain epistemic norms and certain social norms. If we look at science this way, then science becomes activity which is in a way social. And so this activity has certain internal norms which make it to an extent autonomous of science. And then there is society, and society then prioritizes certain things, it provides certain enabling factors, and sometimes it does provide impeding factors. All right, now the rise of modern science, the rise of modern science in the Europe, we were told, was in a way also uh, catalyzed by what Max Weber called certain Protestant values. All right, uh, that valorized empirical work, that valorized that doing physical work was also in a way of doing God's work. All right. So there were a number of values which came together, but also aligned with certain broader social movements like the rise of capitalism. So this alignment between the two enabled then the rise of modern science, and the picture, of course, is more complex. But the important story to tell is that in the rise of the university, what one sees is, at least in Europe, the rise of the university, is that there is a kind of contract which is informally worked out between the state and the university. That the state will kind of support the university, and the state will give the university autonomy inside the university to do and to teach what it wants to teach. Hegel can teach what he wants to teach and nobody can stop him. Hegel is answerable to God. Right? So this is the nature of contract. But on the other hand, the university has to do something for the state. It has to provide the manpower to run an industrial state, and it has to solve societal problems. More than that, it can do anything inside the university, what it does, what it teaches, whether it does pure research, whether it does applied research, that is up to the university. All right. Now, and this was true for the humanities and the social sciences as well, more or less. My own feeling is that in the 19th century, the rising forces of capitalism also needed the humanities and social sciences in order to negotiate the rights for the evolution of capitalism. We are now living at a moment where capitalism doesn't need the humanities and social sciences, because the humanities and social sciences have proceeded in the extension of the domain of human freedom and reason. And that is not what capitalism wants. So today, capital doesn't need the social sciences and humanities anymore. That's a very, very broad argument, but that's my feeling. More specifically, from the 1950s and the 1960s, after the end of the Cold War, at least as far as the world of the sciences is concerned, science, I have argued in my papers also, that science was incubated within what might be called the state, industry, military complex. All right. And that's a crisis which erupted in 2017, 2018 in the March for Science movements across the world. I remember a French scientist screaming out, "Give me the freedom to think." All right. So my own feeling is that any attempt to politically steer science, whether in the capitalist world or even in the communist world, has proved to be detrimental for the pursuit of the sciences and the social sciences.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Ran. Okay, next person is Ram Murthy Sharma, and then I will invite Abdul Jabbar.
My question to Dhruv sir is you that please explain it further if I am not mistaken to understand that what are the when you said that internationalization means that it should be free from culture and politics, or it I understand that as from the cultural and political influence. But do you believe that is it really so that whosoever are getting the scientific processes, particularly in an institutional manner, with the help of state, are they really bereft of culture and politics? And even it's not being exploited uh, nowadays in India in particular. Yes.
See, one is depends what we mean by culture. When within the domain of internationalism, people were talking about science. The prevalent imaginary and philosophy of science was that of positivism, and the belief was that you could separate science from values, that you could separate science from culture. And within the specific context of Nazi Germany, they felt that cultural prejudices, that there was a Jewish science or there was an Aryan science, that these ideas were particularly detrimental to the practice of science, right? However, we also know from the studies on the history and philosophy of science over the last 30 years that culture, that culture and social values do enter into sciences. That science can also be politics by other means. All right. But the thing is that within the internationalism of science, as long as one becomes aware of which values one is supporting and which values we see are detrimental to science, we are in the clear. For example, I mean, eugenics was a political program, was an ideological program that shaped the practice of biology for maybe 50 to 60 years. So we do know that cultural prejudices do enter science. Feminist philosophers have told us how gender biases influenced the practice of the biological sciences for a long time, right? So the thing is that we do need a critical appreciation which comes from scholars who study the relationship between science and society to reveal for us how cultural prejudices and political biases and ideological orientations do enter science, right? And so what you are saying is happening in India today or happening in the United States or in Hungary or in Turkey or in the world of the sciences, uh, it's an attempt to politically steer science, and one should then highlight what are the consequences of these developments for the practice of the sciences. That also takes us back to the previous question. All right.
So, can I go ahead?
Rafat, you are muted.
Okay,
Can
my
I?
apology. Okay,
Can
Dr.
I?
Jabbar.
Okay. Fantastic discussion. I kind of posted my kind of experience as a scientist very briefly on the chat. I think it's individualistic aspect of my training, but it's also now here at the same place. I started in my place. I came here for 6 weeks in my birthplace. So clearly, your understanding of the history of science, the past, present, the future. So how do you see the trajectory of the scientific enterprise coming forward, going forward in terms of global as well as restrictive enterprises? Nowadays, we especially in the U.S., there is a kind of even they are just dismantling education department, appears to me. So in that kind of very populistic, nationalistic kind of atmosphere, I think everywhere looks to me all over the world. So how do you see we kind of move forward in terms of navigating all the challenges? I think you did kind of allude to some of these challenges, but it's kind of time is late. It's going to be 10:30 p.m. in India, where you are, where I am too. I think it's a 1 p.m. there in Atlanta. That's where I am usually. So I think I don't know how much time you have. Maybe you have only about 7 minutes to 1 p.m. Can you kind of briefly explore that possibility of progress moving forward?
Yeah, see, okay, so one is, the nature of scientific activity today is such that science requires huge amounts of funding. All right. And which is why we have moved from the phase also from big science to mega science. Right. And mega science means that if you look at the LEGO project, for example, I don't know how many governments are funding that project, and this thing is taking across probably 100 nations. All right. So science today requires big kind of funding. But if states are not enabling in the sense of, the exchange of knowledge. I remember, during the Reagan regime also, there was for some time much talk about, we should not invite Korean scientists, or we should not invite Indian scientists or Chinese scientists, because they come here and then they learn our things and then we lose our strategic importance. And at that time, the American scientific community said, you know what, they're coming here contributes to our science. We don't see it as being parasitic upon our science and furthering their own sciences. Now, with the rise of this, the rise and rise of the neoliberal university, something else has happened. That there's a feeling within those who support science that science has entered a phase of diminishing returns. All right. And certainly when we talk about what may be called the pure sciences, it's a term from the 1950s, but you know what I mean. Say research in certain areas of cosmology, which may not find immediate practical applications. So what happens is there's a certain kind of science which is receiving funding at the expense of the other sciences in many places. And I think All this is really detrimental to the comprehensive growth of knowledge. I mean, if you look at the knowledge enterprise, it's very difficult to separate the contributions of, you can't separate or disentangle the pure sciences from the applied sciences. These are wrong categories to use. So there are cutbacks, but then there are also setbacks. But I think that at one level, the collaboration as far as the sciences are concerned, maybe America is going through a particularly difficult time now, but we don't see the same kind of problems with Europe just now. And I think we in India must learn to renegotiate our relationships with our partners as to what we should be doing. But I think more or less globally, one can say that the rise of the neoliberal university may prove detrimental to the growth of knowledge. I think things are more difficult with the humanities and social sciences, much, much more difficult with the humanities and social sciences, particularly in regions where there are authoritarian regimes. Over there, the problems, I mean, even in the United States, in several parts of the world, you see closing down of departments of humanities or some of the social science disciplines.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be very good.
Okay.
In fact, scientific journals today are saying that you cannot do the sciences without the humanities and social sciences.
Yeah.
So in some sense, they are saying that this whole the two cultures debate is an irrelevant one. All right. So that's a good development, but can we take advantages of that? I don't know.
Okay, Raina Sahab. Now, within 1 minute, Rafat is gone. I think is off on the screen. Rafat is ending.
Yeah, Razibai, you have probably received a comment from Shrikant Chopra or a question. I did not. Maybe he sent directly to you. That's what he said.
Oh, Shrikant Chopra ji to you. Okay. What do you think is the role of capital creating applied technology in the push for rapid development and institutionalization of science and support of science? The role of
that's a very broad question, and it's really out of my field. That's a question you should pose to people working within the domain of science. I am not so much of a policy expert, but no, I think that now that the state is withdrawing from the support of science, then we also have to find other ways of supporting our scientific activity while keeping our autonomy. I think that should be a matter of central concern. As to how we do that, I'm afraid Rafat Sahab or Chopra Sahab, I'm afraid I don't have an answer. That's not my.
That is perfectly all right. And that concludes the question and answer session. And before I hand over to Dr. Raziuddin, thank you once again, Professor Raina and the other two speakers, Professor Prasad and Professor Zakaria. Back to you, Dr. Raziuddin.
Thank you, Rafat. So जाते जाते रैना जी 1 सेकंड और 1 मिनट में कुछ और बता दीजिए. So you have seen all the color, from 50s in India until today, probably. Science go flourishing, taking on a lot of encouragement. I believe there is still a lot of encouragement, but there is a lot of intrusion also on that science. So this intrusion or this urge to mix or blend something mythical, has this corrupted the Indian scientific themes or thinking, or this has retarded or deviated? What happened?
See, you know what? I mean, I don't think that serious scientists, I mean, from what I know with my interaction with research scientists,
They
I
never.
don't think that it has made any difference to them. But it certainly has demoralized them.
So, okay. So if that is not the case,
Yeah, it has demoralized
yeah.
them. You know, I still luckily happen to be, you know, I mean, I have seen
So is still what
good people.
yeah. So what is still is one, I am wondering that now from the days when we were doing PhD during Indira Gandhi's time, I was at BHU when she proclaimed emergency. So I did my PhD from there. So at that time she opened, but she said that I'm giving you a lot of fund because you always complain, the departments complain there is no fund for science. From that time onward, Indian institution got flooded with money, and there is a lot of training. I mean, they come back, go back to India after getting trained from NIH elsewhere. But the innovative science, the discovery part, or the something new, creatively new, new thing, inventing something, is still missing. What is the real problem there? When you have all training, money, everything, why we are not competing?
See, I think that it depends. I mean, people are competing, but they are in very specialist institutes and very specific domains of research. We have harbored a climate where, well, you have certain elite institutes where very good work goes on in certain areas, and you have, well, we have neglected our universities. All right, and the universities are the
Yeah, there
places
should be.
where the majority
Yeah,
of people are.
yeah,
So
yeah, there should be the place
have
for that.
islands of excellence, and then you have the neglected universities. So that's one. The other part is, and this has come out from scientometric studies, that actually collaborative ties between scientists in India are stronger with their colleagues in the West than collaborative ties between Indian
Within the,
scientists themselves.
yes, yes. So is this something to do with
Within
the prestige associated with that?
yes, I think so that in some sense we don't like, I mean, we talk about some kind of center periphery relationships that continue to structure the world of science.
And that
But
has yeah, that has affected the publications also. Like we could never, we always tried to publish in outside journals and never promoted our own. So the quality of our Indian Journal of Medical Science research, or some I remember, they remain very poor quality. Anyway, 1.5, 2 hours, rather 2 hours, we extracted enough from you, and thank you. And as you said, the lecture is half. It is real. The real lecture should be, I mean, real means it was real, but what happened post Nehru, after Nehru gone? I mean, what happens to science and the rationality and all those? So I'll knock at your door again. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And bye everyone.
Thank you. Thank you once again.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your time, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you,
Thank,
sir.
Okay, bye.
thank you, Om Saab. Thank you.